containing an attempt to recover and reconstitute the lost origins of the myths and mysteries, types and symbols, religion and language, with Egypt for the mouthpiece and Africa as the birthplace.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're standing on the edge of a very deep, very complex, and frankly, a very controversial cliff.
That's a good way to put it.
We are looking at a story that billions of people think they know, the story of the Gospel of Mark, and we're going to pull the thread until the whole sweater potentially unravels.
It's certainly an investigation that challenges the bedrock of, how Western civilization understand its own religious and literary history.
Right.
We're not just talking about theology today. We're talking about literary detective work, historiography, and the very origins of myth itself.
Exactly. So here is the central tension for this deep dive. When we read the Gospel of Mark, the earliest account of the life of Jesus, what are we actually reading? Is it a historical report, written by a guy with a notepad following Jesus around?
Yeah.
Is it, as one of our authors today suggests, a clever, creative rewrite of Greek poetry?
Oh, okay.
And here's where it gets wild. Is it something much, much older?
That is the question. And to answer it, we're going to look at three distinct, heavy-hitting perspectives. Our starting point is a book by Dennis R. MacDonald called The Homeric Epics and the Gospel of Mark.
MacDonald is the catalyst here. His theory is fascinating just on its own.
It is. MacDonald argues that the Gospel of Mark is a deliberate literary imitation, what scholars call mimesis, of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey.
Mimesis, right.
Essentially, he claims Mark takes a character of Jesus and models him on Odysseus and Achilles.
So Jesus is a Greek hero in disguise. But that's just the surface layer, because our mission today is to take MacDonald's theory and critique it by applying the scorched earth lenses of two other controversial scholars, Gerald Massey and Martin Bernal.
Right. We're using them to test MacDonald. If MacDonald says, look, Mark is copying Homer, we have to ask.
Okay, but who did Homer copy?
Exactly.
And that brings us to Gerald Massey. Now, Massey is a fascinating character from the 19th century, a poet, an Egyptologist, a radical thinker, and his argument is, well, it's absolute dynamite.
He pulls no punches.
No. He argues that Christianity isn't new history at all. He calls it Egypto-Gnosticism, literalized.
Massey is a diffusionist. He believes the Nile Valley is the primal source of the mythos. He argues that if you look at the Egyptian Book of the Dead, or the ritual as he calls it, you find the blueprint for the gospel story thousands of years before Judea.
And then we have our third player, Martin Bernal, the author of Black Athena.
Bernal shifts the focus to history and culture. He critiques what he calls the Aryan model of history. He argues that for the last 2 centuries, European scholars have tried to purify ancient Greece, scrubbing away its African and Semitic roots.
Okay.
Bernal argues that Greek civilization, including Homer, was fundamentally shaped by Egyptian and Levantine influences.
So here's the hook and the big question we're trying to answer. If MacDonald claims Mark is copying Homer, is he stopping the investigation too soon? Are we looking at a Greek story, or are we looking at an African and Egyptian story that the Greeks merely borrowed, and that the gospel writers then borrowed from them?
It raises the question of whether we are dealing with a Greek miracle or an Egyptian Genesis.
Let's unpack this. Let's start with the baseline. What is Dennis MacDonald actually arguing in the Homeric Epics and the Gospel of Mark?
MacDonald's core thesis is that the author of Mark wasn't writing history in the way we, understand it. He was writing a sophisticated literary fiction.
Okay, so not a biography.
Not at all. He argues that Mark wanted to create a foundational epic for this new Christian movement, and to do that, he turned to the most culturally authoritative texts of his day, Homer.
So when we see Jesus sailing across the Sea of Galilee, encountering storms, dealing with faithless sailors, disciples,
Right.
MacDonald says, hey, I've seen this movie before. This is the Odyssey.
Precisely. MacDonald calls this mimesis. It's not plagiarism, it's a competitive imitation. Mark is trying to show that Jesus is a better hero than Odysseus.
A better hero, how so?
Well, for example, Odysseus has to be tied to the mast to resist the sirens. He wants to hear them, but he can't trust himself.
Right, he's fallible.
He's very human. Jesus, however, commands the elements. He just speaks and silences the chaotic waters. He doesn't struggle against the forces of nature. He masters them.
So by framing Jesus as a new Achilles or a new Odysseus, Mark is speaking the cultural language of the Hellenistic world. It makes Jesus legible to that audience.
Yes. And the implication is massive. If Mark is rewriting Homeric episodes, then the history of Jesus, the specific events, the locations, the dialogue might be literary invention.
So the whole debate just shifts.
It's just completely from, did this happen, to what books was the author reading?
It effectively dehistoricizes the text. But here's the rub. MacDonald keeps this all very European. He keeps it within the Greek horizon. He looks at Mark and sees Greece.
And that is exactly where our other two scholars, Gerald Massey and Martin Bernal, would step in and say, objection.
Hold on a minute.
Because while MacDonald moves away from literal history, he stays firmly planted in the idea that the literary horizon is Greek. He reinforces the idea that the intellectual playground is the Aegean.
Which brings us to part 2, the Massey lens. And, wow, Gerald Massey does not pull any punches. I was reading through his work, Ancient Egypt and the Natural Genesis, and he basically says the canonical Gospels are a palimpsest.
That's a crucial term. A palimpsest is a manuscript where the original writing has been scraped off so it can be written over again.
But you can still see the old text underneath.
Often, yes. The ghost of the original text remains. Massey argues that the historic Jesus story is written over a much older manuscript, the Egyptian mythos.
He contends it's not about Homer, it's about Horus.
Specifically, yes. He focuses on the parallels between the Egyptian god Horus and the Jesus narrative, and he goes into granular detail. He argues that the very structure of the Gospels mimics the Egyptian two Horuses.
The two Horuses, break that down for us. What does that mean?
So in Egyptian mythology, you have Horus the child, often depicted as being born of a virgin, Isis. Then you have Horus the adult, the avenger of his father Osiris, who is begotten of the father Ra.
Okay, a divine child and a divine man.
Exactly. And Massey argues this blueprint explains the strange gap in the Gospels. We have the child Jesus, the virgin birth, and then silence. Total silence for years, until he emerges at age 30.
And Massey points out that 30 is the age of Horus's second advent, or adulthood in the Egyptian system.
Precisely. Massey argues that Jesus and the Christ are essentially these two aspects of Horus literalized into a pseudo-history.
He even gets into the linguistics, doesn't he?
Oh, absolutely. He points to the Egyptian name for the coming son, which is Iu the Su.
Iu the Su.
And Massey connects this directly to the name Jesus, Iu the Su, the ever-coming son.
Wow.
Right. And another form is Iu the Sif, which Massey connects to Joseph. He weaves this incredibly complex web where Joseph and Jesus are mythical forms of the same original solar deity.
So let's look at some of the specific narrative parallels Massey brings up. Because if MacDonald thinks Mark is copying the Odyssey, Massey thinks Mark and Matthew and Luke are copying the Egyptian Book of the Dead.
They are.
Take the Sermon on the Mount, for example.
This is a great example of where the two theories collide. MacDonald might look for a Greek parallel, maybe a philosopher teaching his students on a hill.
Sure.
But Massey points to the Egyptian Mount of Glory, or Mount Baku. In the solar mythos, this is the horizon where the sun rises. Massey notes that in the Egyptian illustrations, you often have the gods standing on a papyrus column or a mount,
Okay.
accompanied by 4 spirits or brothers, Amsta, Hapi, Tuamutef, and Kupsenef.
And in the Gospels.
In the Gospels, you have Jesus on the mount, and who is with him? Peter, James, John, and Andrew, the 4 brothers.
Oh.
Massey argues this isn't a coincidence. The disciples correspond to these Egyptian spirits standing on the papyrus column. It's an astronomical allegory that has been turned into a story about a preacher on a hill.
He does the same thing with the temptation in the wilderness, right?
Yes, the 40 days in the wilderness. Massey says this is a pre-extant Egyptian motif. It represents the struggle in Amenta, the underworld between Horus and Sut, or Satan.
So the battle between light and darkness.
Drought and fertility, exactly. It's not a historical event of a man fasting in the desert. It's a cosmic event that happens every year.
And Sut is the Egyptian precursor to Satan.
Yes, Sut or Set, the adversary. Massey points out that the dynamic between Jesus and Satan is identical to the dynamic between Horus and Set, even the betrayal.
The betrayal.
Set is the familiar friend who betrays the solar god. Massey explicitly links Judas to this role. He points out that in the Acts of the Apostles, Judas purchases a field with the reward of his iniquity,
The field of blood.
which Massey connects to the field of blood in the Egyptian mythos, fertilized by the blood of the betrayer Set.
That is dark. But here is the part that really blew my mind reading his work. The logia.
The sayings of the Lord.
Right. Biblical scholars often talk about the Q source, or the collections of sayings that the gospel writers used. Massey says, I know where those sayings come from.
He does. He argues they are the logia kuriaka, the sayings of the Lord, but the Lord is the Egyptian Lord, Horus, or Uemhetep. He claims they are lifted from the Egyptian ritual.
So the Sermon on the Mount, the Beatitudes, all of that is from Egyptian texts.
According to Massey, yes. He goes so far as to suggest that the gospel, according to Matthew, is actually based on the Egyptian gospel according to Mati.
Mati.
Mati in Egyptian implies truth or law. It's a title for Thoth, the scribe of the gods.
Wow.
So Massey suggests that Matthew is a linguistic drift from Mati. The gospel, according to Matthew, essentially means the scriptures of truth and law, originally written by the divine scribe Thoth.
So if we apply this Massey lens to MacDonald's theory, MacDonald says, Mark is looking at Homer, Massey says.
Massey says MacDonald is looking at a shadow.
A shadow of the shadow.
Exactly. Massey would argue that if there are Homeric elements in Mark, it's because the Greeks themselves, Homer included, were borrowing from this primal Egyptian source. But he goes further. He argues that the historic interpretation is a trap.
A trap.
He distinguishes between the Gnostics, the knowers who understood these stories were allegories about the human soul, and the historic Christians who took the myths literally.
So the Gnostics knew that Horus, or Jesus, was a symbol for the divine spark within every person.
Right.
But the literalizers turned it into a story about a guy named Jesus who lived in Galilee.
Precisely. Massey calls it a fictitious human history. He believes the literalization was a degradation of the ancient wisdom. He says, and this is a quote, "The Christ figure didn't need Homer to exist. He had been Yu the Sioux in Egypt for 13,000 years.
13,000 years. That is a staggering claim. It completely reorients the map. But speaking of maps, this is the perfect segue to Martin Bernal.
It is.
Because if Massey provides the mythological receipts, Bernal provides the historical context for why we ignored those receipts for so long.
Right. We move from the 19th century esoteric Egyptologist to the late 20th century historian of ideas. Martin Bernal's Black Athena isn't just about ancient history, it's about how we write history.
And Bernal talks about the ancient model versus the Aryan model. Let's define those, because this is crucial for understanding why MacDonald might have a blind spot.
So, the ancient model is what the Greeks themselves believed. If you asked Herodotus or Plato where their civilization came from, they would say, oh, we learned from the Egyptians and the Phoenicians.
So they were open about it.
They were. They acknowledged that their religion, their names for the gods, their alphabet, it all came from the south and the east.
We stood on the shoulders of giants, and those giants were African and Semitic.
Correct. But Bernal argues that in the 18th and 19th centuries, European scholars constructed a new model, the Aryan model.
And this was politically motivated.
Hugely. Driven by the rise of racism and anti-Semitism in Europe, they couldn't handle the idea that the pure Greek civilization, the cradle of the West, was a mongrel culture with African roots.
They scrubbed it.
They systematically denied the Egyptian colonization legends. They downplayed the Semitic influence. They invented a Greek miracle, the idea that Greek civilization just spontaneously combusted out of pure Indo-European genius, independent of the massive civilizations right next door.
And this is where the critique of MacDonald comes in. Because if MacDonald is treating Homer in Greece as the primary horizon, the starting point, is he unknowingly using that Aryan model?
That's the Bernal critique in a nutshell. Bernal would say, yes, Mark might be using Homer, but what is Homer?
What tradition is Homer standing in?
Exactly. Bernal points out that even the name Athena, the patron goddess of the Odyssey's hero, is likely African. He argues that 60% of Greek vocabulary is non-Indo-European.
60%.
60. And he traces huge chunks of it to Egyptian and West Semitic roots.
That is massive. That's not just a few loan words.
It is. It suggests a profound cultural intermixing. Bernal notes that Herodotus explicitly stated Greek religion came from Egypt. Modern scholars dismissed Herodotus as credulous, essentially calling him gullible.
Right.
But Bernal argues the ancients knew their own history better than 19th century German professors did.
So if we look at MacDonald through the Bernal lens, MacDonald says Mark mimics Homer. Bernal says,
sure, but Homer mimics the East.
So Mark is getting Egypt secondhand.
Exactly. If Mark imitates Homer, and Homer reflects Egyptian and Semitic culture, then Mark is indirectly mimicking Egypt through Homer. MacDonald stops one step too early. He stays in the European safe zone.
Let's talk about the bridge Bernal builds. He talks about Crete and the Levant as these conduits for culture.
Yes, the cultural flow in the Bronze Age wasn't isolated. You had the Pax Egyptiaca. The influence of the pharaohs extended well into the Levant. You had Byblos, which was practically an Egyptian colony.
No?
Bernal argues that ideas, myths, and language flowed from the south and east to the north and west, from Egypt and the Levant, through Crete and the islands, into mainland Greece.
So when we see Greek myths, like the story of the wandering hero Odysseus or the dying and rising god, we shouldn't see them as purely Greek inventions.
No, we should see them as local adaptations of much older Afro-Asiatic themes. For instance, Bernal discusses the double axe symbol in Crete, connecting it to Egyptian symbols. He talks about the concept of
Justice and cosmic order.
Right, and how that concept influenced Greek law and philosophy. If Mark is operating in a world shaped by Homer, he is operating in a world shaped by Matt.
It seems like MacDonald is doing rigorous work, but he's playing in a fenced-in yard.
That's a great way to put it.
And Massey and Bernal are just tearing down the fences.
That's a perfect analogy. MacDonald is performing a literary autopsy, comparing text A, Mark, to text B, Homer. It's very precise, very scholarly. But Massey and Bernal are doing geological surveys. They're looking at the tectonic plates that moved the ground before the texts were even written.
So let's synthesize this. We have MacDonald, Massey, and Bernal. Where do they agree? Because they seem to be shouting at each other from different centuries.
Well, the biggest point of convergence is non-historicity. All three of them agree that the gospel narrative is not a straightforward historical report.
Right. None of them thinks Mark is a transcript of a deposition.
Exactly. MacDonald sees it as fiction. Massey sees it as myth. Bernal sees it as a cultural construct. They all agree it is a construct.
And they all agree on intertextuality.
Yes. They all agree the authors were borrowing heavily. Mark didn't just look at the sky and write. He looked at other books, other traditions. He was standing in a river of tradition.
But the divergence, that is where the so what comes in.
The divergence is about the origin point.
Where the river starts.
Precisely. MacDonald points to Greece. He says, look at the similarities to the Odyssey. Massey points to Egypt. He says, look at the similarities to the ritual and the Book of the Dead.
And Bernal?
Bernal points to an Afro-Asiatic Mediterranean where you can't even really separate Greece and Egypt that cleanly because they are so inextricably mixed.
And then there's the theological bomb Massey drops, the historic delusion.
That is the most radical divergence. It's what makes him so controversial. MacDonald might say Mark invented a fictional history for a real movement. Bernal might say Mark reflects a mixed cultural heritage.
But Massey says
the very idea of a historical Jesus is a corruption. He argues that the Gnostics held the true keys, that these were myths about the soul, the Horus within.
And that literalizing it was a mistake.
A catastrophic mistake, in his view. He thinks turning the ever-coming son into a Jewish peasant who lived for 33 years severed our connection to the original wisdom.
It's a tragedy in Massey's view.
Right.
We traded eternal truths for a fake biography?
Precisely. And in doing so, we lost the ability to read the symbols. When we see Jesus walking on water, we argue about physics.
Right. Could it have been an ice flow?
Whereas Massey says we should be thinking about the solar god traversing the upper waters of the sky. We're asking the wrong questions because we're reading it on the wrong level.
So what is our final assessment here? Is MacDonald wrong?
Not wrong, but perhaps narrow. MacDonald's thesis is rigorous in its literary comparison. The parallels he draws between Mark and Homer are undeniable and compelling. You can't just dismiss them. But by ignoring the Massey-Bernal perspective, MacDonald inadvertently reinforces a Eurocentric view. He reinforces that Aryan model by treating the Greek text as the ultimate source, the primal scene.
So to truly understand Mark, we have to look past the Greek miracle.
Yes, we have to see the Egyptian Genesis. The gospel story is likely a composite. It has the Egyptian solar myths and eschatology that Massey identified. It has the Greek epic narrative structure that MacDonald identified. And it all rests on that deep, interconnected Afro-Asiatic foundation that Bernal mapped out.
It's like a layer cake of civilization. You can't just eat the frosting and say you've eaten the cake.
And you can't understand the frosting, the Greek language of the New Testament, without understanding the ingredients that went into it, which came from all over the ancient world.
This has been a wild ride. We've gone from the Sea of Galilee to the walls of Troy and then all the way back to the temples of Luxor and the Great Pyramid.
It really shows that no story stands alone. Every story is a retelling of an older story.
Which brings me to a final provocative thought to leave you with. If the gospel story is a retelling of the oldest myths of humanity, the struggle of light against darkness, the coming sun, The journey of the soul. Does it lose its power? Or does it become something even bigger?
That is the question, isn't it? Does history make it true, or does myth make it universal?
And consider this. Massey talks about Yu the Sioux, the ever-coming sun. He mentions the legend of the wandering Jew. We usually think of that as a medieval Christian legend about a man cursed to walk the earth until the second coming. But Massey flips it.
He does. He suggests the wandering Jew is actually a memory of the wandering solar god of Egypt. Yu is the wanderer of eternity.
He has no rest.
He has no rest. He is always coming, always rising, always setting, always cycling through the underworld and being reborn.
The solar god who travels the sky forever. Maybe the story belongs to everyone, not just one specific moment in history. Maybe we are all watching the same play, just with different costumes.
And perhaps by recognizing the Egyptian roots, we don't lose the gospel. We reconnect it to the rest of the human family. We realize that the Western tradition and the African tradition aren't opposites. They are, and always have been, the same stream.
A stream that flows from the Nile. Thank you for diving deep with us today. Keep pulling those threads, and we'll see what unravels next time.
Containing an attempt to recover and reconstitute the lost origins of the myths and mysteries, types and symbols, religion and language, with Egypt for the mouthpiece and Africa as the birthplace.